and welcome to the last session of the Theology and Worship track here at the Southeastern Symposium. We're excited to have our current PhD student, Kevin Hall, give his paper, Leadership Modeling, Christian Leadership Development Through Mentoring as Informed by the Social Learning Theory. Well, before we get started, I'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsor, InterVarsity Press. InterVarsity Press has made available all of their ebooks for 50% off during the COVID-19 crisis. So if you'd like a little bit more information about InterVarsity Press ebook library, I've dropped that into the chat for you, as is. Like I mentioned, we have Kevin Hall. He's a little bit different than some of the other paper presentations we've had so far. He's one of our PhD in leadership students. So for those of you who would be interested in doing similar research, our PhD in Christian leadership is a deep dive into biblical, philosophical, and the theological roots of effective Christ-honoring leadership. This degree prepares men and women to lead at the highest levels in Christian organizations, churches, denominations, and schools of higher education. So if you'd like a little bit more information about our Christian leadership degree, I've also dropped that into the chat. Well, for those of you who haven't been with us before, I'm going to give you a quick explanation of the Q&A process before we get Kevin started. If you'd like to ask a question, you can drop that into the Q&A box at any point. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a toolbar with a Q&A icon. If you have questions that you'd like to ask Kevin about his presentation, just go ahead and type those questions in there. But we want to give you an opportunity to voice your question directly to Kevin. So if your question is chosen, I'll write something like, hey, that's a great question. Can you raise your hand? Once you're instructed, if you'll click the raise your hand icon, and then once it's time, I'll unmute you and give you the opportunity to voice your question directly to Kevin. Well, we're super excited to have you here. Like I said, Kevin Hall is one of our shining stars in our Christian leadership program. So without further ado, take it away, Kevin.
All right. Thank you all for Zooming with us today. I'm going to jump right in and skip around in my paper a little bit to get it all in. I hope this is helpful for you. So in the introduction, here we go. Leadership is a social science. It is fundamentally an observable pattern of actions and behaviors. One then can learn to lead and develop as a leader. The development of others is, quote, the highest calling of leadership, end quote, says Maxwell. Leaders should be growing and developing themselves and growing and developing others. Leadership is distinctly Christian when it is directed and informed through a biblical worldview as Christian leaders lead from biblical Christian convictions. Leadership development was a high priority for Jesus as he was intentional in developing disciples and sending them out, and it was a cornerstone to Paul's ministry. The best leaders behave as role models for followers to emulate, says Bruce Aviola. Role model leaders are more than an example to imitate as they model in relationship or mentor. Mentoring is the non-negotiable responsibility of successful leadership. Leadership development is an intentional process. Here's my definition. It is an intentional process of influencing established and potential leaders to acquire, reinforce, and translate proper leadership character and behaviors into effective leadership. In order to best develop leaders, leaders should focus on influencing one's character and behaviors. Mentoring is a key means to developing others to help them grow in character and competency. A strategy towards this end is needed in order to properly guide leadership development. Utilizing social learning theory to inform a leadership development strategy helps identify principles for leaders to follow in order to develop others effectively. It suggests a strategy focused on developing leaders through modeling in relationship. I briefly outline where we're headed. I'm gonna show social learning theory explaining how most learning occurs through observation of a proper model, give some biblical examples. We're gonna look at the needs for the leader who is modeling to work on themselves. And then finally, I'm going to give aspects of a leadership development strategy informed by social learning theory to provide how to develop leaders through modeling in relationship. So first, we have to understand social learning theory. So here, the heading social learning theory. Albert Bandura's social learning theory explains that learning can occur through observation. Bandura says that, quote, most human behavior is learned by observation through modeling, end quote. Following this understanding of learning, the role model in leadership development is so incredibly important to achieving one's full development potential. Learning through imitating observations is one of the most innate learning styles, says Douglas McConnell. Greg Ogden argues that modeling is, quote, the most significant learning dynamic and is where the real instruction occurs, end quote. People seek a demonstration, not just an explanation, because one learns first by association before one can understand by explanation. Those words I get from Robert Coleman's Master Plan of Evangelism. As a leader models leadership, leadership development takes place in the life of the observer. Social learning in theory involves 4 sub-processes. These interrelated steps are attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Attention involves attention to and recognition of the model's behavior. Retention consists of remembering the observation and retaining it in a meaningful way. Reproduction means put together an actionable response and has abilities and skills to produce action. Motivation comprises reinforcement that either keeps one from certain actions or incentivizes one towards certain behaviors. For leadership development, attention occurs when one acquires the behavior through observing the model. Retention and motivation occur through the reinforcement of the behavior in order for it to be memorable and desirable for imitation. Reproduction occurs when one translates the proper behavior into effective leadership. Now, neuroscience helps explain this learning process, which recognizes the validity of other learning theories, such as experiential learning, yet remains distinct from those theories. So here's subheading of benefits of relation to neuroscience. The chameleon effect is a good example to explain how one learns from observation. This effect describes how we imitate the postures, body movements, and facial expressions of others through our observation and interactions with them. Researchers have found that the act of perceiving another person's behavior creates a tendency to behave similarly, end quote. Imitation from observation occurs unconsciously and unintentionally. This imitation learning occurs because we understand the implications of others' behaviors as our brain create, quote, an action simulation of the behaviors we are observing as if we are doing the same things ourselves. So research shows that the mirror neurons in the brain code together the acts one observes in a similar manner as the acts one performs. Therefore, observational learning takes place in the same way as performing the desired behavior. One learns from observation behaviors one will imitate. One of the benefits to a social learning leadership development strategy is that learning is streamlined. One does not need to spend extra time learning and relearning by executing a behavior or a task in direct experience. Bandura's theory explains that, quote, virtually all learning phenomena resulting from direct experience can occur on a vicarious basis through observation of other people's behavior and its consequences for them. Man's capacity to learn by observation and to acquire large integrated units of behavior by example without to build up the patterns gradually by tedious trial and error, end quote. Behavioral learning and change can occur without the learner actually performing the behavior or directly experiencing the consequences. While both a place for formal educational learning and a need to imitate and implement effective leadership behavior exist, one can build a base of developmental learning through observation. Now, some distinctions in relation to experiential learning. However, argue that a primary way to learn is through experiential learning. Experiential learning expert David Kolb argues that learning from direct life is where direct sense experience and in-context action is the primary source of learning. Thus, in this view, successful leaders develop primarily through lessons of experience by learning from on-the-job experience. John Cotter says that successful managers develop over a long period of time and through different experiences. In this way, one learning from personal success or failed actions, or trial and error. Learning thus occurs when change in the individual is a result of reflecting on a direct experience, which results in a new abstraction or application. A social learning theory-informed development strategy does not disregard learning through direct experience. Rather, it recognizes experiential learning as one way to learn, while explaining that it is not the only or the most effective method of learning. It doesn't deny that God uses successes and failures to shape and grow leaders, nor does it deny that one can learn from making mistakes while leading. While the social learning and theory-informed strategy relies on learning from failure and mistakes, learning is through observation of the model and the consequences of the model's trial and error. Unlike experiential learning that implies one has no need for a teacher since learning rests within the student, social learning relies on a model as a teacher. One learns, quote, a wide variety of behaviors and skills much more efficiently and safely than would be possible through painful trial and error, or even through direct instruction and reinforcement, end quote. Thus, the observer benefits from the previous and ongoing learning of the model, allowing the observer to learn effective leadership in an expedited fashion. Another way social learning theory utilizes experience is through its reinforcement of behavior. It explains that learning can occur by direct experiences where consequent actions reinforce and inform correct behaviors. In this way, one learns what one must do in order to gain beneficial outcomes or to avoid punishing outcomes. Social learning theory differs from experiential learning, though, as behavior can be regulated not only by directly experienced consequences from external sources, but also by vicarious reinforcement and self-reinforcement. Learning can happen without external consequences, as, quote, most behavior is not controlled by immediate external reinforcement, end quote. Unlike experiential learning, social learning theory distinguishes between the learning behavior and performing or imitating behavior. Behavior can be learned vicariously through observation without enacting the behavior. One learns behavior before performing the behavior, says Bandura. One learns most behaviors through the influence of an example or model, and this learning can occur deliberately or inadvertently. Reinforcement is considered facilitative rather than necessary, as other factors can influence learning besides response consequences. While reinforcement may increase the probability of reproducing the behavior, a good deal of imitative learning can occur without any reinforcements, either to the model or to the observer. Extreme reinforcement is not necessary, as observational learning can occur through the model behavior and accompanying cognitive activities. Therefore, while one can learn from the consequences of unguided actions, a good model is a much better teacher with shorter process of learning. Social learning theory acknowledges the role of extrinsic feedback as important, but provides other forms of reinforcement influences that have an effect. Other forms of influence that affect people are the experiences or consequences of personal actions, the observed consequences of others, and the reinforcement of oneself creates. Influence from observing other consequences is called vicarious reinforcement. Vicarious reinforcement comes as vicarious punishment when negative consequences are observed, or vicarious positive reinforcement when desirable outcomes are observed. Self-created reinforcement is called, you guessed it, self-reinforcement. Self-reinforcement may come through self-esteem, self-evaluation, a positive self-concept, self-reward, self-direction, self-motivation, self-encouragement. Furthermore, social learning research has shown that one can successfully model self-reinforcement for a learner. In social learning theory, reinforcement serves informative and incentive functions. Therefore, within the theory, reinforcement functions in the sub-processes of attention and retention as informative and motivation as incentive. Observational learning translates into action when positive incentives are present. Anticipation of reinforcement can also serve to help retention and provide motivation regarding the observed behavior. Without direct personal experience of an action or direct personal reinforcement, one can learn and later imitate behaviors through observing models in action. I'm going to briefly cover the biblical modeling. Not going into detail here. Jesus is a prime example of one teaching through modeling and relationship. Even during his teaching ministry to large crowds, he mentored his 12 disciples and intentionally showed them how to live. Chuck Lawless points out, quote, Jesus told his disciples to make disciples, and he modeled how to do that, end quote. He called them in the relationship and spent quality time with them, sharing life with them. Modeled to his disciples behaviors he wanted them to learn. Longenecker argues that the disciples were to be with us in order to become like him, and through this relational time with him, they grew conceptually, experientially, emotionally, spiritually, practically. I'm going to move on to an example from the book of Hebrews of observational learning through modeling. So the book of Hebrews says, remember your leaders to you, and you can observe the outcome of their lives, imitate their faith. For the writer, first they're exhorted one to remember. The verb means to recall from memory, but without implication that persons have actually forgotten. This remembering shows a time of attention and retention in order to recall the information learned. Social learning theory explains that one can learn and store behaviors for future action. Bandura says, quote, from observing other forms an idea how new behaviors are performed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. The reader's audience will bring back memory what they had previously learned. The writer of Hebrews calls the audience to recall more than just verbal instruction. He says to carefully observe. One is to consider and think back on what one heard. Observation was the leader of their behavior, namely the way they conduct on daily behavior. The writer then tells the audience to imitate, that is, to behave in the same manner. I'm giving the definitions from the Greek English lexicon of the New Testament. I'm going to look into those. Thomas Schrein explains that remembering their leader doesn't just mean recalling their words. Their instruction was matched by their lives, end quote. The writer urges the audience to put into action the same type of behavior they learned through observing their leaders. I'll quickly go through Paul as an example of imitation. Regularly, he's calling others to imitate his example, exhorts the church at Philippi to join together in following his example, just as, quote, just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do, end quote, in Philippians 3:17. He behaved in certain ways in order to be a model for others to imitate. Paul's mentoring of Timothy is a strong example of his modeling and relationship, which you can go deeper into from 1 Timothy. I'm going to move into personal development because a learning theory-informed leader development strategy evokes the need for leaders to model appropriate and desired behaviors and traits. One implication of the theory for leadership development emphasizes the prerequisite for leaders to exemplify the desired behavior. As role models, leaders need to behave in the way in which they want followers to learn and behave. The leader must develop to the type of leader one desires to model. Thus, for leaders to develop others through modeling and mentorship, the leader must first spend time on personal development. I'm going to quickly go through here. I'll assume I'm going to head, or you've already worked yourself so we can get to developing others. So working on yourself, you see Jesus as an example. He prioritized time to go to be with the Father. Paul intentionally developed others, but his leadership development approach first is personal development in order to serve as a role model to all and be worthy of that imitation. Leaders will produce what model, and they will model they are. Leaders cannot effectively lead, develop others until first their own values, because these values define one's character and determine one's behavior. Leaders need to work their people skills, because in this model, you're mentoring through relationship, you're developing through relationship. So the best model in relationship, leaders must develop their relationship abilities. Proponents of social learning assert that leaders who do not model the desired behavior undermine efforts to effect lasting change. The leader's model and behavior be attractive and credible to the observer. And once a leader has developed character, credibility, and competencies worthy of teaching, the leader can take the next step towards modeling effective for the development of others. So here we move into leadership development a little more. Social learning theory prompts the leadership development strategy to focus on modeling and relationship. This development strategy is intentional and shapes the character and behavior of the observer. Through this mentoring strategy, influence behavior acquisition through attention. They reinforce behavior to affect retention and impact motivation. And finally, the model translates behavior for reproduction. In this way, mentoring in relationship fulfills the four main sub-processes associated with social learning theory. So leadership can be learned because it's an observable set of skills and abilities, remember, and leadership is rooted in one's behavior. Therefore, one can observe and learn effective leadership behaviors from a strong leader model. This modeling happens better in relationship. Social learning informs this area of the strategy by showing that learning takes place among and through other people. Leadership itself is relational. It's all about people and exists in relationship. Modeling in relationship initiates connecting before leading. Bruce Aviola says, quote, "A basic lesson in leadership development is that one should try to know one's followers before attempting to develop them into leaders," end quote. Leadership development begins with starting a relationship and getting to know each other. Investing in attention. This very briefly, leadership development is an intentional process. Developing other leaders does not happen by chance. Leaders should be deliberate and purposeful in their modeling. Modeling in relationship takes conscious, willful effort. A leadership development strategy informed by social learning theory implies an investment on behalf of the leader. Leadership development takes time and resources. Chuck Lawless explains that mentoring is costly, end quote, as one prioritizes spending time and money. Because developing leaders requires a commitment to investing time and resources, a leader can develop only a few people at a time. Character towards behavior. Leadership development influences proper character and behavior. A social learning theory informed development strategy involves continual learning and growth. This lifetime learning includes personal growth, not only leadership skill development. As part of a leadership development, the leader include modeling one's own personal plans for growth in the process of teaching and helping develop the potential leader's plan for growth. Of the leader is not just one-time visit, an ongoing context of the leader's life. It is character, this is the power and impact potential necessary for lasting legacy, says Howell. Leaders cannot develop in others one does not already possess. Continued leadership growth and development towards a place where they begin to lead from eminence, a distinguished reputation as a great leader. Social learning theory is whether or not a model is attractive, competent, and successful contribute to the overall probability of that model behavior being imitated, end quote. In turn, allows developing leader greater margin for development. A leadership development strategy informed by social theory directs towards learning reciprocation. Leaders influencing leaders learn from those with whom they are modeling a relationship. Good mentors instruct and model competent leadership for the mentee to observe, but they also observe the developed leader as one attempts to follow what the leader has modeled. Acquire through attention. Leaders influence the acquisition of proper behavior through modeling in a way that allows high observable attention. Social learning theory forms the leadership development strategy to involve teaching desirable and effective ways. A necessary point for a mentor relation is attraction. Leaders are attractive as they provide behaviors that are desirable for the learner. Attractiveness of the model influences the attention processes of the learner observing the model and to the extent to which the learner acquires the model. Quote, attractiveness is a means of channeling observer attention to the model, end quote. In social learning, observed behavior is attention is focused on the model and the model behavior. A leadership development strategy informed social learning includes providing a positive environment for leadership development. Modeling leadership, part of the process for creating appealing leadership development climate. Through building trust, the leader provides a safe, effective environment in which to learn. Without this culture of trust, leaders cannot establish and sustain the development and empowerment of others. Therefore, leadership development is not only a product of leadership development culture, but also a mechanism for creating that culture. Reinforcement for retention. The leadership development strategy reinforces observed behavior to affect retention. A leader development strategy informed by social learning theory calls for further instruction. Leaders be aware of the need to analyze and explain behaviors in order to best reinforce them properly. When one learns from observing a behavior, one may or may not consciously learn the value guiding the behavior. Also, there may be times when a proper behavior results in a negative consequence. In this case, one may be discouraged from pursuing a behavior that has resulted in an adverse consequence, as people are more likely to adapt or adopt modeled behaviors which produce rewarding success effects. Quick, big little example of this is Jesus taking time to point out and explaining his servanthood and servant leadership as he washed the disciples' feet. In the same moment, he points out and observations from his disciples on the behaviors of the leaders of the time who were lording their authority over others, and explains this is not what you should do even though you've observed it. A leadership development strategy of modeling and relationships suggests the need for leader vulnerability, as vulnerability aids in retention. Mentors and mentees will make mistakes. The mentee may observe an undesirable behavior and its consequences, and leaders must be honest about their areas of challenge. Leaders who share mistakes teach others and foster relationships. This is Lencioni's understanding of trust, of being willing to be vulnerable. Here, the leader development strategy also reinforces observed behavior to impact motivation. The informed leadership strategy points a leader to build trust. You can read books on trust, so I'm jumping ahead. The leadership development strategy translates observed behavior for reproduction of effective leadership. A leadership development strategy that includes multiplication of leaders exhibits a leader as visionary. The leadership development strategy informed by theory suggests that leaders share opportunities to lead. You're empowering others to take the lead and ultimately releasing them to and deploying them to lead. So in conclusion, through the social learning theory informed leadership development strategy, the potential leader attains all four categories governing social learning: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Through the development work of the leader demonstrates the desirable product of a developed leader to the mentee. The mentee observes the desirable behavior of developing leaders and experiences the consequence or product firsthand as a developed leader. Therefore, as the leader sends out the developed leader, the new leader can be held accountable to imitate the leadership development strategy of modeling in relationships.